Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and I do have the final video update of the Champion starter build that I recommended in my starter build video for the Bestiary League, which I've now been playing for pretty much a full week, and I've taken it all the way through the endgame as far as I can, doing everything except for Uber Elder, which just seems to be too much work for me to get to with the limited time I play throughout the day. So we have gone through, we've changed into Reeve and Blade Flurry when I was initially Dual Strike. As I mentioned, Dual Strike is just a good starter, or it's a good middle ground between the two skills, and it is a lot of fun and it will get you everywhere. But Reeve is definitely the ultimate end game for the character for clear speed, and Blade Flurry is the ultimate end game for the single target, almost definitely. Now I do play Reeve throughout the character almost exclusively until the tier 16s, and then Elder and Uber Atziri and Guardians and all of that. So I'm definitely reaving for everything, including boss fights, but then once you get to the tier 16s, you absolutely want to swap into Blade Flurry, which is as simple as a few gem swaps. In this case, only 3 gem swaps in the chest, and we are fully Blade Flurry. But as I said, it's not really much of a hassle because I am Reeve throughout the entire game basically, and only swapping into Blade Flurry when I really want to get the biggest single target I possibly can. The single target on Reeve for these high-end map bosses is still absolutely fine, especially if you swap in a Conk effect, and as you can see, we do utilize Adrenaline quite often to get much more DPS happening. But a lot of the time I don't even swap in Conk effect, I stick to increased area in my 6th link, as you can see here, and it is still plenty of damage and it doesn't really matter. It just means you have to take the fight an extra, 1 second or something. But you can see we do pop Adrenaline before most boss fights, killing the tier 15 Carcass boss with Reeve before he even goes up, which is pretty crazy. And then when you actually swap into Blade Flurry for pure damage on single target probably doubles, something like that. It really is a night and day difference, and for everything up to tier 16, it's too overkill even with my fairly modest gear, which I will go over at the end of the video after the clips. There's really nothing special about what I'm wearing. It's basically just the PogChampion doing real heavy lifting. Now all of these Guardian maps, starting with this Phoenix, have pretty hard rolls on them. This one has like 100 extra fire damage. He's faster and there's LE weakness happening. It's basically not very fun, so I do have to rezone a few times for Flask and sometimes play it just a little bit safer. But Champion in this state, the way I've built it with the damage that I've got, is probably the most well-rounded character I've had in recent times for defense and offense, because I haven't gone too far out of my way for any expensive gear. I haven't really got anything super special in the ways of damage taking like an Abyssus or increasing damage like an Abyssus, but the damage is just absolutely absurd when it does happen, and the survivability is pretty good too. It might not look like it in this Minotaur, but this Minotaur has like extra fire damage, ignite. I have 60% slower regen, which is a real kick in the nuts for a build like this. So it was a really tough Minotaur, but if it's an easy Minotaur, I'm pretty sure you will kill him in roughly 1 second with this build without trying. It's really quite a joke. It just depends on the map mods that you have. So it does look a bit sketchy. It really depends on the map mods. But for the most part, I did every single Guardian. I did Red Elder, all the Red Guardians, and Uber Atziri Deathless without worrying too much about my life, except for on those 2 clips you just saw of the Guardians. And this here is a Chimera, which I used increased area for even. Didn't even bother swapping into Conk effect, completely unnecessary, and the damage is still just ridiculous. Now, absolutely fair warning, this Shaper kill is pretty graphic content, so if you cannot handle it, if you are squeamish, turn away now. By God, what happened? Where'd he go? This was just some of the easiest, smoothest, most obliterated Shaper I've ever had. The path of building tooltip in the end, or single target DPS for the Blade Flurry, is something like 3 million damage. Now off of a 280 DPS foil, no Abyssus, that is just ridiculous. And this here is my first Elder fight for the league. It's a tier 14 Elder, which is a now Red Elder fight on the higher end. Killed him pretty quickly, pretty easily, and you do now have to deal with a harder portal phase, which this build and character didn't notice at all. It was still basically the same portal phase as always. It was just a bit tougher to maintain killing the ads, I'd say, because they were kind of all over the place as I was using Conk Effect with my Blade Flurry, and I do not think I recommend that after having tried it. So probably either use Reeve or Increased Area for that phase, and it should be fine. I did end up leaving quite a few of those little darty shooting guys alive, and it did not look very pleasant. Pretty close to a death on that one. Uber Atziri, however, another just really piece of cake fight. Absolutely huge damage. The survivability is pretty damn good, and overall just another smooth end game experience. So I do want to go over all of the gear for this character, what it took to build. The way I respect, because I was dual strike up until 83, went into Reeve and Blade Flurry at around that time and never looked back. And just basically what Champion does for us, because I really do think Champion at the moment is one of the strongest Ascendancies, and this Ascendancy rework was, well, it was a really successful one that maybe they can look at for the Elementalist and think, why not something like that? So let's go ahead and get through everything we can. Currently level 92, it is a champion, as I mentioned, and the reason for champion is, like I've said, worthy foe. Enemies you taunt take 20% increased damage, which is basically a 20% damage multiplier to everything you have, and then enemies you taunt cannot evade attacks, which means that this current chance to hit I have, 77 and 72%, goes up to 100% after you taunt something with the first hit that you managed to taunt, and then you have 100% chance to hit, which increases your crit chance as well, and is just a stupid amount of extra damage, paired with the extra defensiveness of Unstoppable Hero, the extra damage from the Intimidate, and then the Adrenaline when you trigger it using the setup that I've recommended, Blasphemy, any curse, doesn't matter, but currently Poacher's Mark, and Blood Magic. So you press it once, unpress it, you are triggered with Adrenaline. It's going to last 20 seconds. Trigger it before boss fights for the most part, because at this stage of my character, you definitely don't have to do it almost ever. You only really do it for boss fights or whenever you feel convenient, maybe at the start of the map, something like that. But it is a lot of extra damage with 100% increased damage, 25% attack and cast speed. It is very nice to use, but I wouldn't really recommend relying on it too much if you're uncomfortable until you truly do get a hang of it. And once you've got like fast weapons and good damage, that's when you really don't need to rely on Adrenaline that much anymore. And yeah, my foil over here is okay attack speed, and that's why I've got pretty good attack speed overall, just managing to stack it everywhere I can. So then Adrenaline isn't that big of a part of your gameplay, but early on when I had really shit gear, I did use Adrenaline quite frequently. So that's the main reasons for Champion, and I will show you exactly what I'm talking about right now. So currently we're looking at 2.5 million Blade Flurry damage with Frenzies, with Fortify, Taunt, Crit Chance, nothing too special against Shaper. So I do only have like 75, 77 hits, something like that, because I haven't built into any hit, and you don't have to. And you can see that when removing Taunt, 2.5 million damage here, removing the Taunt, so pretend we don't have that good PogChampion Taunt node, we lose half our damage, almost half our damage. Now that is ridiculous. Granted, like I said, you would have like another 10% hit chance if you balance around it. That does stress your gear out more though, and does become pretty hard to do. So overall, what happens is if I then take Berserker and give myself 50 rage, I have about the same damage as Champion. So Berserker, with all of its downsides, from damage taken and minus regen and shit, gives you about the same damage as Champion without Adrenaline. So you have your Champion, you get taunted, all of a sudden you back up to 2.5, which is about what the Berserker's damage is. I won't show you, but take my word for it. And then you pop Adrenaline, which I do for just about every boss fight, reliably, as you should be able to see through the clips. We then go up to 3.1 million. So Champion has a lot more damage than Berserker in the ideal situation like this one, and none of the downsides while being tankier. So explain that one. PogChampion, that's all I'm going to say. So going back to what the character is and the gear and all that, I did end up respecking from the bottom side of the tree, because when I went to Reeve and Blade Flurry, these nodes down here just don't really make sense, so it makes it a bit more efficient to then respec up here and grab the extra life clusters and rely on most of your little extra damage coming from jewels. So fill out everything I can, get all the life, and down this way as well, and also dropping this down here because it's not the most efficient life, and the accuracy from this node isn't really important, so it's mostly just then about skipping that and getting better life and refining your gear elsewhere. So without going super heavily out of my way on the tree for life, I have managed to hit 6,300 life. Now that is largely in part to a belly of the beast. I initially bought one that had 36% life. I then found one that had 40% life and managed to 6-link it pretty luckily. Don't be too scared. The 6-link isn't that important on this build because the melee type of playstyle here, or the physical type of playstyle, just doesn't have that many good gems if you're not utilizing things like damage on full life, which I just don't think are reliable enough in this sort of build. So I do use a chance to bleed for 44 to 66 damage, and the worse your weapon is, in my case it's pretty fucking bad, then chance to bleed gets better and better. So for my situation, chance to bleed is something like 20% damage, which is pretty worth using as a link. And then as well as that, I have maim, which isn't very strong, but there really isn't much else you can do. So the 5-link to 6-link comparison isn't huge, and the rest of the gear is pretty humble, I would think, for the damage we're getting. The only real special item I'm wearing is this scepter. So it's a shaped scepter for an offhand stat stick because, as I mentioned, in Reeve and Blade Flurry, you only attack with your main hand if you have an offhand that you cannot attack with. So in this case, we're running a scepter. You cannot Blade Flurry or Reeve with a scepter, meaning you only attack with your main hand, meaning this is an offhand that is purely used for its stats. And in this case, you try and get a shaper one, and you try and roll gain % of physical as extra fire, or as extra lightning, or as random element, or elemental to chaos damage. All of that stuff can be gotten from a shaper scepter, at least level 75 on item level, mine's 76. Ideally, you get an eye level 80 plus. Absolutely ideally, you get an eye level 85, but 76 or 75 plus is just fine. And then we alt regaled it. So I managed to get like an extra lightning, and then the lightning damage mod, and then regaled the fire, something like that. And then you put crit multi on it too. So it's not too hard to get something like this, but it is a big boost, and it is a very large boost to the character's damage overall. You should be able to get at least one extra physical to damage mod quite simply, and then your end game goal is to get 2 of them, but you can get even harder and even more stuff on these sticks overall to get much more damage, because yeah, my weapon isn't that huge, but it does get covered up by some of the damage from the stat stick, because my weapon's what, 280 PDPS. I paid 1x for this thing and then crafted crit onto it. If you just simply craft a jeweled foil with Merciless or Tyrannical and then manage to multi-mod it with Aurion, it's going to be much better than my foil by like 50-60 DPS just by itself. So all it needs is a Tyrannical or a Merciless, and you've already got a much better foil. But the idea is just to get some good physical damage, a much better attack speed roll than Skaver, so it actually feels good, because overall in damage this should not be any better than Skaver. It's just simply a lot faster and should feel a lot nicer to use. So the other things to mention are flat physical damage on your rings and amulets does go a long way. So a steel ring, for example, is pretty good to have. Mine's fairly basic. I just managed to alt regal this thing. Bit of physical on my ring. Amulet just has some crit multi. Definitely want something like that. And then some physical damage if you can get it too. You will need to get int somewhere, so I have it here, here, and here, because you need about 100 int to be able to use some of the things we use, like Conk Effect and Area, so it's not terribly easy to balance your stats there. A Star Conjure is all I use just for the attack speed, crit, life. You can go Abyssus and get about 50% more damage. You'll have to rebalance probably a bit of defense just to feel better about it. Now, I'm not using Abyssus simply because, as you could see throughout those clips, completely unnecessary. Could you get a shitload more damage? You could. Do you need to? Absolutely not. So it's not really worth losing the survivability just for more damage, unless you want to go absolutely full potato with a character like this. In that case, be my guest. The mana leech I get for this build is purely sustained off of the glove craft from Haku, but if you can't get any mana leech on your gloves, rings, or amulet, then just grab a 1-point node over here or a 1-point node over here. That's what I used for a very long time until I got these gloves. Not much else to mention though for gear. I think that pretty much covers it. Resist and life and strength everywhere else you can get it. And the current links for Blade Flurry, I should mention, Blade Flurry, melee physical damage, increased area, which is subbed out for conk effect on single target, chance to bleed, LE damage with attacks, and maim. I believe LE damage with attacks is my last gem I'm using, and it's only going to be good for your character if you have some decent LE damage. So that means you're running Hatred, Herald of Ash, and you have a decent stat stick with additional elemental damage. If you don't, then added fire is probably the way to go. Could be some other things like crit strikes. If you have a foil with almost no crit, then absolutely get a crit strikes gem instead, even instead of chance to bleed, because you can get a much higher DPS foil with no crits on it, and then just grab crit strikes, and that should be a net gain overall. For the most part though, I think that's all I got to cover for the gear. I will absolutely post it in the thread and the path of building and all of that, and you can play around with it yourself. For the Reeve though, if we're doing Reeve links, now that is Reeve, multi-strike. I've been using increased area as my 6th link. You don't really need it, but it feels pretty good to do. So that's what I've been running. And then maim, melee fizz, and chance to bleed. Entirely up to you what you do in those links. You don't really need increased area. Could go crit strikes, could go ruthless. But I didn't really like the unreliability of Ruthless, so it didn't really matter too much. Entirely up to you guys. I don't know what else to say. Lion's Roar, absolutely insane as well for the build. Once you get high enough damage, it doesn't really get in the way with the knockback, so you do probably want one of these. Atziri Flask gives you a good chunk of extra damage. Can slap a Taste of Hate in place of probably one of these two, but otherwise Diamond Flask absolutely essential. Now if we just have a quick look at the path of building again, I will show you that 2.6 million damage, that's with the Blade Flurry, and that is with no adrenaline once again. That is with Fortified, that is with Frenzy charges, because you do single target Frenzy just on the setup here to build up 3 Frenzy charges. You don't really have to do that, but I prefer to just start out my fight a little nicer like that. And then as well as that, we have ticked Intimidated, so that's 10% increased attack damage that you get from Champion, Taunt, Maim, and that's probably all you really need to tick. So that's what the path of building looks like to be set up. And shit, one other thing I'll mention, that's it. War Chief, I use War Chief for a bit of extra damage and AoE clear speed, but if you just want him as a pure stat stick for tooltip, you drop your War Chief down. He does give you 300,000-400,000 damage, but Protector will do about the same and give you more attack speed. So if you'd rather the attack speed, then by all means use a Protector. If you'd rather just big damage, less attack speed, then Ancestral War Chief, and he may help you get a bit of AoE damage done too. Make sure you attach Maim to him too, because that will help keep Maim damage up. However, I think that's it for this character, guys. I will potentially still farm some Uber Atziri and all that tomorrow, a bit more endgame, see if I can make my way into high maps and get some Red Elder done. All I really want to say is Champion was just an absolute delight to play. I loved being pretty tanky while having a really strong solid damage on what I think is not the greatest gear, and it did get me through just about every map I could, a Red Elder, and I'm going to try and proc another one soon. I think it is a very strong end game character and will probably be able to take on Uber Elder, though I have no idea. I'm trying to wait to find out exactly what that takes until I actually get there myself. So sorry for the slightly long video. Hope that covers everything you need to know about this character. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Hope it's going well for you as well, and see you next time.